Okay, guys, we are back. All right, so we were on number 4, where we're comparing Sue to the narrator, right? So remember that the narrator is the one that would feel ashamed. This is when the mom would be reading them the bedtime stories about the goblins and the witches, and the narrator would be scared, but his sister Sue would be excited at all of it, right? So we want to pick the word that matches the excitement, right? Her eyes snapping over the fights means that she was like into the story, right? So we're trying to match this language, black eyes snapping over the fights. And the best word to do that is feisty. It shows us that she's kind of like with the action of the story. Does that make sense? If we look at all of the other words that are the options here, none of them match the same connotation. So mean and sad and unintelligent, these are all negative connotated words, right? So the narrator isn't trying to diss his sister and say she's mean or she's dumb. They're just trying to say that they were into the action of the stories versus the narrator themselves would be scared. Does that make sense? So we want to avoid these words because they're negatively connotated and dissing the sister, which is not what the narrator was trying to do. Okay. Next, the narrator compares himself to Sue in order to highlight his blank. So again, the point of that, just the comparison, is that he's showing that he is sensitive. He was sensitive to all of these stories about the witches and the goblins and whatever else, but his sister, she was the feisty one. She was into all of these stories. So this one is to highlight his sensitive nature. It's not to highlight his youth. And again, it's actually the opposite of this because the narrator is actually older than his sister. It's not to highlight his indifference because it's the opposite of this. He's not indifferent. He cared a lot. That's why he had to leave the room. And that's why he felt ashamed and sad about all these stories. So he's not indifferent. He's not sneaky either. So this is kind of like the trick answer that they want you to pick here because he would sneak out of the room, but he's not sneaking out of his room because he's sneaky and he's this like suspicious character. He's sneaking out because he's embarrassed and because he doesn't want to hear about all these scary stories because he's sensitive to them. So this is sort of the trick answer that I think they wanted you to pick. And then finally, there's no evidence to show that he has an easygoing disposition. Again, it's the opposite of that. He's more like sensitive and he cares, so not so easygoing. Easygoing matches more indifference. Another sort of trick that helps me is if two answer choices are similar, like in this case, indifference or easygoing disposition, that can kind of help us eliminate both of them because they're very, very similar and both of them can't be true. Okay, next they're asking us about the narrator's feelings about the gory pirates. So the gory pirates is what he describes as frightfully fascinating. So we want to match the language of that, frightfully fascinating. So right away, frightfully matches scared. Those are synonyms. And then fascinating matches intrigued. So this is an easy one. All you have to do is match the language exactly, and that's exactly what we have here in choice B. Good. Be careful of all of the above answers. In this case, it's kind of simple to say that it's not all of the above because all of the above, like each choice is so different that it would be unlikely that they would all be true. For example, how could he be both disinterested and thoughtful and angry? They're all kind of opposites. So it's unlikely that those are all true. But again, be wary of all of the above answers. Always think twice before you pick that. And then finally, the passage suggests that the father's occupation is connected in some way with. This one is another easy one. This one should be the sea. We have many, many, many words that suggest that, right? So the author mentions ocean. In the really beginning, the author mentions harbor. And then towards the end, he talks about running away to the dock. So all of these words, the common denominator is that it has something to do with the water, with the sea. Okay, questions, thoughts, comments, anything that you guys want to say about this passage or how I annotated it or how we went through the questions? Helpful, not helpful? No comments. You guys understand everything? Yeah, you guys are good? Okay. All right, so we'll do the poem next. One thing that I want to do before the poem is to do like another little note session about passages, since we're kind of switching now back to poetry. Just some tips for reading comprehension to summarize everything that I said verbally as we went through this passage. And then we'll do the poem, okay? So let's do that next. So let's make a little note sheet. This is going to be tips for reading comprehension. Okay, so remember I told you guys one thing that I do is I try to think about what kind of passage am I going to be reading about, fiction or nonfiction. So that's kind of how I want to structure this note page to sort of get you guys thinking in a similar way that I think. Everything in test taking is about putting your brain or putting what you're reading into different categories. It's true for the math section too. Like when you read a question, you're like, okay, they're testing me on algebra, or they're testing me on a word problem, whatever it is. And then you go through that pathway in your brain and you're like, okay, I know how to think about it, because then you store all the times that you did similar questions in that one sort of box in your brain. Does that make sense? That's kind of how I want you guys to think. You become very systematic when you take an exam, basically, as time goes on, because you guys are going to be doing this for a long time. That's kind of how my brain functions at this point, because I've taken so many exams. So in order for you guys to become more systematic, you need to create the framework in your mind of what are the different types of passages that they can ask you about. So one way to do that is to think between fiction and nonfiction. So fiction, again, to me, fiction means like a story or a narrator, sort of similar to what we've read. And then nonfiction kind of means like dry, just a bunch of facts. They're telling you about marine biology or some scientific topic. This is more like article. Okay, so let's do nonfiction first, because that one is easier. So one thing that you guys should know about any time they give you a nonfiction piece of writing is that this is going to be very structured. This is what you guys should know. This is going to be structured. And it's always going to be structured in the same way. Now, it's going to be a big help to you guys when you're reading the passage. So it's going to be structured in the same way that you guys are taught to write. So similar to how when we go over how to write your essay, it's going to be in a similar structure to that. So what I mean by that is there's going to be a very clear thesis statement. You guys are going to be able to find it, point it out. Oops, sorry, I don't know why I made myself huge. You're going to be able to find it, point it out, and tell me this is the thesis. And it's always going to be in a predictable spot. It's going to be somewhere at the end of the first paragraph. Similarly to where you guys should put your thesis when you're writing your essay. So this is sort of no surprises. There's going to be a thesis statement in the last sentence or in the last two sentences of your introductory paragraph. And similarly to your thesis statement, there's also going to be topic sentences. And this is going to be at the beginning of every single body paragraph. And the key is that each one of these topic sentences is going to be supporting your thesis. So it's going to be in support of your thesis. And then you're going to have a conclusion. And in your conclusion, you know what you're going to do? You're going to repeat your thesis. So whenever you're dealing with a passage like this, things are going to be very structured. And within each body paragraph, you're going to have your topic sentence, which we mentioned, and then you're going to have supporting details. So let's add that in here too. So then you're also going to have supporting details within each body paragraph. And again, the goal of all of this is also to support your thesis. So if I give you an example, I can say that Olga likes to tutor because it's fulfilling, because it is a hobby, or let's say because it brings her money, and I don't know, let's say I only have 2, but you guys should have 3 on your essay. So let's say I only have 2, just for this example. Let's say this is my thesis. So then I'm going to have a body paragraph that says tutoring is fulfilling because 3 things. It reminds her of when she was a student, because she likes interacting with kids, and it's a hobby. And you guys don't have to copy this. I'm just doing this to show you, right? So this is going to be my topic sentence. And notice that my topic sentence just fulfills why I like to tutor, right? That goes back to my thesis. And then in this body paragraph, I'm going to then expand on all of that. I'm going to talk about why it reminds me of being a student, and how when I was a student, I had different mentors. So I want to be that for other students. And I'll talk about how I like it. So it's fun and it's kind of like a hobby and it fulfills me. And it's good to do things other than my own school stuff and whatever else I'm doing in my life and blah, 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 blah. And I'm going to fill in my paragraph. Does that make sense to everybody? And then I'm going to go do the same thing with the second example. And I'm going to say, also tutoring is good because it's lucrative, right? So lucrative means that I get paid for this. And then I'll talk about all the blah, blah, blah reasons why that's important, because as a young person, it's important to have a job, and whatever else. Does that make sense? So this isn't for you guys to copy down. This is more of like a thought experiment of you guys understanding the structure that I'm talking about. And it's important for you guys to understand the structure because you're going to read passages like this, but it's also important because this test has a essay section. So eventually we'll do a whole hour, 30-minute thing on how to write your essay, but that's kind of the crux of it. That's what I want you guys to start understanding in terms of structure. You're going to have an introduction with some hook where you reel the reader in, and then at the end you're going to have a thesis, and then each body paragraph is kind of going to be structured like this silly example that I gave you guys. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so that's sort of the nonfiction end of things. What do we focus on when we are reading a fictional passage? So for a fictional passage, I want you guys to actually focus on the plot, which is exactly what's happening. So when I think about plot, you should think about what is going on, like the actual events. And then usually there's always going to be like a climax or a turning point in a story. So you want to find that one event where everything kind of sort of changed. The other thing that I want you guys to think about is characterization or character development. Which is, how is the character changing or developing in every single paragraph? And one thing that helps with this is dialogue or quotes. because that kind of tells you what the character is like. So for example, we learned about the mom in the first passage from what the narrator is telling us, but we can also learn from the dialogue where she told Belle, the caretaker, that the kids are under no circumstances allowed to go down to the dock. So that kind of shows us how the mom is potentially strict, how the mom has opinions on her husband's profession with the harbor, and how she doesn't want the kids exposed to that. So dialogue can teach us a lot about what characters feel and think. The other thing that's important in fictional stories or in stories in general is paying attention to the setting. So setting is not just where, it's also when. So think about the time and place that the story is going on. And then the other thing I mentioned to you guys already is point of view. So think about first versus third, which tells you who is telling the story. And then the last thing, which isn't always true, but sometimes these fictional stories, they have like a moral or a lesson at the end. So I'll put a star here, moral / lesson. So in this story that we read together, there wasn't really one. But sometimes there's like a bigger point to all of this, and usually they will tell you this in the conclusion. So if you suspect that they're trying to teach you something, there's a moral or a lesson, or a question asks you, I would look for that answer in the conclusion, because usually that's where they put it. Okay, any questions? All right, I'm gonna leave this up for like 1 minute because I see people are still writing, and then we're gonna go do the poem together, okay? Okay, can I flip, or are people still writing? Okay, 1 more minute. Okay. Let's do notes on poems and then we'll do the poem and then I'll let you guys go. All right, so let's talk about poem strategies. Okay, so when you guys read a poem, the first thing that I do is I look at the shape of the poem and I look at the title of the poem. So sometimes the shape of the poem can kind of give us things away. They can give us a clue to certain things. So sometimes the poem will just look like this, right? It'll just look like a regular poem. But sometimes the poem will have like a weird shape. Like one time I read a poem about like a slithering snake, and the author literally made the poem look like this. And then sometimes you'll see the poem's shape will look something like this, like it'll get narrow and then it'll get very tall again. And then basically there's different poem shapes, right? And sometimes they don't mean anything and sometimes they do. So usually what I try to do is just pay attention. So you don't have to like take this to the next level and like there's going to be like one tiny indent and you're going to be like, what does that mean? But if it's obvious and the poem clearly has a certain shape or a certain capitalization pattern or certain indentation, certain rhyming, all of that, like if it's very obvious in your face, I would just consider that because the author's probably doing that on purpose for some reason. Does that make sense? So I usually like bringing this up because sometimes students ignore it or they don't think it means anything, but it could mean something. So just keep your eye out for that. Now, the first thing that I look at is, let's call this category sort of structure / rhythm. So one part of that, like I said, is the general shape of the poem. And another part of that is capitalization. Specifically, I want you guys to think about capitalization of improper nouns. So who knows what an improper noun is? So what kind of words should we capitalize according to grammar? If I say New York City, do I capitalize that or no? Yes. So that's something we call proper nouns. So names of cities, names of people, names of animals, whatever it is that you guys want to name, those are all called proper nouns. So those are things that we're used to capitalizing that you should capitalize. Does that make sense? Everybody should capitalize. It doesn't matter if it's in a poem or if it's in a story, or if it's in a book. I will always capitalize somebody's name. Something that is an improper noun is if I randomly capitalize like storm. If I randomly capitalize rain. It's words that normally I would not capitalize. Like if I wrote a sentence and I said, it is raining, I don't have to capitalize raining. But if the author does, if for some reason you notice the author says it is raining, you should pay attention to that. So anytime the author capitalizes something that you would not normally capitalize, that isn't a name of something, you should think, okay, so what is the author trying to do here? And usually the reason they're doing that is for emphasis. And very commonly, authors will capitalize natural elements. So authors will capitalize like storm, rain, wind. And usually it's like an homage to nature and an emphasis of like the fact that certain natural elements almost have like living thing power. Does that make sense? So we know that they don't, but they're trying to personify them as if that they do. So this is very common literary, not really a literary device, but sometimes authors do this just so you guys are aware. Other things that sometimes are capitalized are like, I've seen mother be capitalized. I've seen son be capitalized. I've seen something like garden be capitalized. And of course, always it's for a different reason. These are just some examples so you guys have them in your brain. And then the last thing that you guys should think about is punctuation. So punctuation, also anything that's italicized or anything that's bolded. So again, all of these things would be for emphasis reasoning. Notice where the author puts commas, right? So sometimes authors will put commas really randomly, or they'll put periods in the middle of a sentence. Usually commas or periods are the author trying to communicate to you that something is shifting, right? It's an end to whatever thought that they were trying to tell you before, and it's the start of a new thought. So if the author chooses to do that in the middle of a line or in the middle of a stanza, think about why did the author choose to do that there? Why didn't they choose to finish the stanza and then start a break, right? So all of this is meaning for a break, right? So think about why is the author making you put a break there? And then the last thing that I mentioned out loud and I didn't write down yet is just rhyming schemes. So sometimes every line will rhyme, sometimes every other line will rhyme. Sometimes there will be no rhyming in a poem at all, but they can ask you about that. So it's just something that I want you guys to notice. Okay, the next sort of big category of things is comprehension. So we talked about the structure of the poem, but now how do we actually understand what's going on? So one thing in terms of helping you understand the structure is reading the title of the poem. This usually tells you the topic. The other thing is point of view, which can help. What can help with this is pronouns. And the same exact thing as what I told you guys before with first person versus third person. So this is also important in poems. And then finally, it's important in poems, don't take things literally. So usually in poetry, it's always a literary device. So the author is always trying to suggest something other than the literal. So it's our job to figure out, and that's what brings us to the last sort of point of this discussion, which is literary devices, which are very commonly used in poetry. Okay, so one that we already talked about, that you guys know about is similes and metaphors. So that's going to be the first one that I write down. So simile and metaphor is just a comparison like we talked about before. And again, the main difference between them is that a simile uses like / as, and this does not use, not uses doesn't make sense. Let's say doesn't use. Okay, so usually similes are easy for you guys to pick out because you can just look for the words like or as, and then you can easily find one. But metaphors are a little bit harder because it's harder to say that something's a comparison when you say exact, like you say, instead of comparing with like or as, you just say directly. So instead of saying the streets were safe like my mom's eyes, you would just say the streets were my mom's eyes. So sometimes it's hard for students to understand that they're obviously the streets are not literally the mom's eyes. So if you notice yourself like reading a sentence like that, and it's very like direct, that could help you understand that it's a comparison. Does that make sense? Because it's the something direct that doesn't make sense. Is that clear? Okay. So that's simile and metaphor. The next big thing that poems use a lot is imagery. And this is actually something that's really important for you guys to also use in your Hunter essays. So imagery is something that appeals to your senses. So usually it uses a lot of adjectives. So appeals to your senses. So it's this like strong description describing how something smells, how something tastes, how something looks. The way that you pick out imagery is it should have a lot of descriptive words. So many descriptive words like adjectives and adverbs. And usually the description is focused on how you feel, how you see, hear, smell, all of those things. And a lot of times they use imagery to describe the setting of something. So and you should use this device a lot in your essay as well. The next literary device that I want to talk to you guys about is personification. So this means giving human qualities to non-human things. So an example of this is like the rain danced on my windshield, right? Because the rain can't literally dance on your windshield, only people can dance, or sometimes animals can dance. Rain doesn't really dance. So we're personifying it. We're giving it a human-like quality. So let me make a new page.
Could you go back?
Sure, 1 second. Okay, so I'll leave this back up for people copying for another minute. Can I flip? Okay, so the example is the rain dance on my windshield. I want you guys to think about personification with forces of nature. So this is very common for authors to personify forces of nature. And then another device that you guys should know is hyperbole. This is just exaggeration. An example of this is something like, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. So it's not literal, nobody's literally going to eat a horse, but it's very, very exaggerative statement, which is called hyperbole. And then a few other ones that you should know. One is alliteration, which we've mentioned before. This is the same consonant sound being repeated. So an example here is like slimy, slithering, sneaky, snake. And obviously the consonant sound that's being repeated here is the SSSS. Another one that we have, which is, I always mess up the spelling, is onomatopoeia. I don't know if that's right. But onomatopoeia, this is when when the word sounds like the sound we're trying to emulate. So something like boom sounds like an explosion, or ding dong sounds like the actual sound the doorbell rings, something like that. word sounds like the sound. Example is boom. The reason I'm spending so much time on this is not just because of poems, it's also because you guys should use all of these devices in your essays. So when I say that you should start your introduction with a hook, all of these literary devices are one way that you can start with a hook. Does that make sense? So you can start with onomatopoeia, you can start your essay with boom or bang or ding dong or whatever it is, or you can start with alliteration, or you can start with a lot of imagery. You should use a lot of imagery in each one of your body paragraphs. That's something that they're going to specifically grade you on. Does that make sense? So this isn't not just for the poem side of it, but this is also for you guys to incorporate into your own essays as well. And then the last few that I just want to mention is irony, paradox, oxymoron. These are all pretty similar. And we've seen it come up before with like the frightfully fascinating, or something ironic in your story. And these are used less often in poems, but just words that I wanted to get out there, to know that you guys are aware. Okay, so the meeting is gonna end in 1 minute again. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just going to give you guys that minute to finish copying this if you need. And then the meeting will end and then everybody will join again. We'll review that last poem called Slanted Figures. And that'll be the end of our first lesson, okay? So when the meeting ends, please join again just for the last 10-15 minutes. We'll review the poem together. And that'll be the end of our first lesson, okay?